So I guess when we think about new mobility, I must admit most of the discussion tends to happen in the construct of urban settings and cities in particular. Why is that important and relevant? The notion of utilization has been talked about a lot today. Sharing models which allow a single asset to be used by multiple consumers, that you can only leverage those models in an urban setting where you can move from consumer A to consumer B to consumer C. The models that exist today are a progression, I guess, of models we've seen. So we had the notion of true ownership, whether you bought a car outright or on hire purchase. You've sort of gone to lease, PCP, PCH. We've talked about that today. We're getting into fractional ownership with shared ownership models, and we had James on from Drive Now earlier today talking about the concept of a car available to use for when you wanted to drive it. And then we're getting into the realm of ridership. And often the terms ride sharing and ride hailing are used interchangeably, but they're actually two distinct terms. Ride sharing would be companies like BlaBlaCar or an Uber pool option in Uber, whereas ride hailing is a pure, you have exclusive use as a passenger of the car. Now, as we've sort of gone through the progression of how do you actually make money, the asset utilization becomes relevant. So an outright owned car tends to get used 4 to 5% of its useful life. The shared ownership models in London, as we're seeing them now, are starting to get to the 8 to 10% utilization rate. In leading cities like Madrid and Berlin, we're seeing asset utilizations get up to the 15-odd%. You sort of break even on car sharing at about 12% utilization, 12 to 13% utilization. You might reinvest some of that profitability into growth, but on a unit economics basis, you're starting to break even at 12 to 13%. So people are starting to make money on these models. The question is how long is the commitment and how much more do they roll out and with what speed? So this is today. And I guess the question that often comes is, what's going to happen in the future? We've sort of heard the term usership being described earlier today. I won't get into the technology of it from particularly, but in a world where we talk about the progression of autonomy from level 2 ADAS systems, autonomous emergency braking, and so on, when you get to level 4 autonomy, and we'll talk about when that happens in a few slides, you then have the option to remove the driver from the car altogether. And we have to draw the distinction between self-driving cars versus driverless cars. And when you take the driver out of the equation, you move to a materially different part of the transportation cost curve. That's going to be transformative, and we'll come to why in a few slides. As I promised, we always start with the voice of the consumer and some really punchy facts on these couple of slides. So the left-hand chart showing what the consumer is actually doing. So this is looking at the people taking driving tests in the UK, the people who took those tests in 2007 and the people who took those tests in 2009, and looking at what proportion of the relevant populations was accounted for. That's a 10 percentage point drop of 17, 18-year-olds taking their driving test when 10 years ago, it was a rite of passage for people to get their driving license. What are they drifting towards? And the chart on the right highlights utilization of new mobility models. So we ran a survey a few months ago in London saying actually as a proportion of the relevant populations in those age groups, what are they actually doing with respect to utilization of Uber? You sort of see close to 50% of the less than 45-year-olds use Uber relatively frequently. And that's when Uber has just been in its nascency in London. We clearly have something to be done with the older demographics, and over a period of time, that'll be a demographic shift that washes through the population. But consumers are sending a strong signal here. They're saying, we actually want choice. We don't necessarily want to be encumbered with asset ownership, particularly in urban settings. And we may be delaying and defraying our choice of ownership as a result, or usership even. So what does that mean in terms of the product providers? these are early days in the world of new mobility, but if the chart on the left is saying what's the impact of car sharing, and the chart on the right is what's the impact of ride hailing. For every car deployed, and these are academic studies, not our sources here, for every car deployed in a car sharing mode, whether it's a Drive Now, Zipcar, Car2Go, and so on, about 8 to 10 cars are not being sold, or consumers are selling their cars as a result. Now, these will be low mileage cars, so people saying, actually, I don't use the car very much, so I'll get it on demand rather than have it sitting as a depreciating asset on my forecourt. But we sort of already start to see that people are going away from car ownership. Now, in the big scheme of things today, it doesn't feel like a big deal, right? So, there are 2,500 car share cars in London today, and even if by a factor of 10 people choose to not get their cars, that's only 25,000 cars out of 39 million. Who cares, right? But the question is, when you wind the clock forward, what does it look like? Similarly, on ride hailing, you may not appreciate the numbers, but there are 42,000 Uber drivers in London today. And within the short space of time, we have almost 80,000 car sales in London and Paris, which are the two big dominant Uber cities in Europe. You have already seen car sales drop by 80,000. Now, always difficult to attribute precisely the reason for this, but these are academic studies that are trying to pin down the impact of these. So urban settings, be wary. There are changes coming in that model. When we think about the addressable market and why are people really excited about mobility, I was struck by a number in Lauren's presentation earlier today, which was the size of the entire vehicle finance market was 41 billion pounds, if I'm not mistaken. What we have on this chart here is looking at the total revenue pool for transportation in London. So there are 9 billion consumer motorized journeys in London every year. And I appreciate London is not representative of the UK and probably almost a bookend of the complexity of cities as far as they exist. But it's a good working example to see how a multimodal city behaves. 9 billion journeys, and the y-axis on that chart is saying what was the average cost of those journeys. And if you multiply those two, you get to 40 billion pounds. So that's the revenue pool available. So the mobility entrants are looking at this, the disruptors are looking and saying, I want a share of that pie. And when you think about Uber, when it entered London, it came in with the Uber Lux and the Uber Exec proposition. It was the black car proposition, it's the limousine service. Where is that benchmarked against? So if you think about the left two slivers on that chart, that's the taxi industry in London. Really tiny, less than 100 million journeys. Uber Exec was squarely, in terms of the price offer, squarely targeting the taxi market, the black cab market. But Uber decided, that's a really tiny market to go after. If I want to be relevant to the 9 billion journeys, I need to create propositions that allow me to move down the cost curve for the consumers. So the development of UberX, which is at 50% cost to Uber Exec, was a very designed move to say, I want to enlarge my addressable market. Uber Pool is a progression of that. So that's 25% further off the cost of the UberX proposition. It's not a dissimilar proposition to what the car share companies are doing. So we've done this on Zipcar's proposition in terms of the station-based versus the free float models. There is a progression there to try to get to free float where you're just paying 39 pence a mile or something of that nature. You are trying to make it relatively cheap for consumers to have a car available on demand, which gives them the service proposition they need. Just out of context, Uber's already up to 100 million journeys in London, so that's 2.5% of London's car journeys are now Uber journeys in 2 years. Now, they're not only taking away from car journeys. That's the important point, and that's why TfL is worried. What's happened in the last 18 months is that bus ridership in London has dropped by 7%. Now, after 20 years of plus 1% growth of bus ridership in London, to see a 7% drop in bus ridership in London over the last 18 months is distressing, to say the least, to TfL. So you can see why they are quite concerned about the development of new mobility modes, and as a result want to impose stronger regulation on the industry. But cost isn't the only dimension, right? I mean, we think about customers, they don't just choose on cost. I certainly enjoy a plurality of modes available to me in London, and I choose based on, if I had a child, I would choose a car that could take a stroller or a buggy in it. If I was carrying shopping, I needed to make sure it had enough storage. You make informed decisions based on the mode and the purpose of the journey. And the new mobility models that are coming in need to have a really clear idea of what they're trying to target here. So if you see the sort of private car as the big orange blob in the middle of that chart, car share is perhaps slightly less convenient than owning your own car. You do have to walk 200 meters away to get to the closest car share, and that's only in Zone 1 in central London, probably not very true if you get out to Zone 3 or Zone 4 in London. Whereas ride-hail is much more convenient and trying to get to a price point where it is compatible to owning your car. So that's the design of the ride-hail model, is can you get it down to a price point, because we know it's going to be more convenient. You press a button on your mobile phone, and hey presto, the car shows up in 3 to 5 minutes. Now the big, I mentioned earlier about robotaxis, and why do we think that's going to be transformative? So we actually think in a world where car share and ride-hail converge, you get to robotaxis. So rather than you walk 200 yards to get to the car comes to you. So that's sort of the convergence of car share and ride-hail. When is this going to happen? Good question. I mean, the Chancellor expects, and he last week said 2021, unlikely, fair to say. So the chart on the left is sort of saying average disengagements per year of driving. So this is Google tracking and publishing its data, saying, in an average year of driving of 8,000 odd miles, which is the UK average, how many times did the driver have to take back control of the vehicle in order to prevent a collision? So as recently as 2016, that happened 1.6 times in a given year's worth of driving. That is still a 100% probability of an accident. By contrast, the motor insurance industry today has a claims frequency about 15 to 16%. So there is still a ways to go before even Google, who is by far and away the leader in this space, to get to true driverless level 4, level 5 driving. And that's in sunny California or Phoenix, Arizona. That's not in London or European contexts. So there's many a million miles of testing that needs to happen before that happens before it happens in the UK and Europe more broadly. So we're thinking 2025 is a more realistic planning horizon. But when that happens, it is going to be transformative from a cost point of view. So the chart on the right is saying, what do you pay per kilometer or mile as a consumer for transportation today? So a new private car, if you index it to 100, if you think about the unit economics of a robotaxi, which comes when you need it, that's going to be 16% of the cost of owning your own car when you factor in the value of your own time. That's going to be really, really different. TfL's worried. Now, that could cause a whole bunch of congestion in London as well. So that's a separate issue that needs to be tackled. But in cities not like London, where smaller cities, Zone 2, Zone 3, where public transportation doesn't exist, and all the robotaxi is doing is replacing a private car, that's where you get the benefits of robotaxis, where reduced car ownership comes to be a feature of those markets. Now, I'm conscious of time. I've probably overrun already. Very last slide on OEMs. Now, all of the major OEMs are taking positions on downstream participation. So while I appreciate from your day-to-day lives, it still feels like business as usual. At the very highest levels, Mercedes, BMW, GM, Ford, Volkswagen, all of them are taking positions in a variety of downstream participation, whether it's car share fleets, which is true for Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen. Jaguar Land Rover, and we'll hear from Dovu in a minute. But maybe I'll just draw attention to Maven Gig, right? The leasing sector. Maven Gig is GM's proposition for gig economy workers who want to deliver Amazon packages, they can rent a car for a week. It's a GM proposition. Now, the key messages from that is, from your perspective, clearly there's going to be a declining urban car population, but there will be some segments that are resilient, particularly trade, and vans will definitely be resilient. Fleets as a proportion of the car parks will increase, and all of these are going to be run at fleet services. Maybe with blockchain we might have decentralized ownership, and I'd love to hear thoughts on that. OEMs definitely playing a much larger role, but the OEMs can't be all things to all people. We've all seen their various attempts at playing a greater role in downstream participation. They are going to need support. So fleet management and greater participation on downstream value chain support from established players are going to be an important source of support that people in this room can offer the OEMs. And we haven't gotten to electric yet, but in the horizons we're talking about, everyone's talking this is going to be purely electric as well.